Hi everyone, it's lovely to be here. Thank you very much for having me. So before I get started, I wanted to tell you a little bit about Pyrra so you guys get a feel for who we are. So this is me with my two co-founders, Eric and Welton. And around 2018, 2019, they had both left the military where they were doing intelligence in Afghanistan and Iraq and very, very physical things. And they got math degrees and data science degrees, and they ended up at Human Rights First, a big not-for-profit, where they were working with some LLMs. You know, could they use AI to identify and track violent far-right extremists in the US who are hanging out on nasty little places called 4chan? Fast forward to January 6, 2020, when the attack on the US Capitol happened. And their little LLM picked up signals in the week before. And they sort of said, guys, something serious is going down. Does anyone want to pay attention? There's a problem going to happen. And sure enough, we saw what unfolded in the US, and it was pretty dramatic and pretty shocking. So the board of Human Rights First came to them and said, guys, maybe there's something here. No one else really picked up on this, what was going on. Maybe there's something more we need to do. At which point, Welton, the guy in the middle, gave me a call. He and I knew each other from the Atlantic Council and said, hey, Beck, this is a situation, but we don't know anything about business. Can you help? And I said, sure, let's have a chat. And we did some investigation and we worked out that actually maybe there was a bear there. You know, no one else was really doing anything like this. So we launched a startup. But one of the most important things before launching the startup was a discussion that we all had about what type of company we wanted to be and what type of company we didn't want to be. And, you know, we didn't want to be a tech company that made the world worse. We wanted to make it better. So we said, all right, just because we can develop tech doesn't mean we should. And that sort of should be a core tenet of what we do here with AI. We also shouldn't sell our product to everyone because our technology can be used to hurt people as much as it can be used to help people. So we sort of said, all right, we're not going to sell our product to governments in countries where we know they abuse human rights, where they know they target minority groups. And we sort of set some other boundaries as well, of course, but generally speaking, these are the core tenets that have really been important in guiding us as we build and develop the company, and I think have really helped us grow the type of company that I'm proud of. So what do? We collect social media, specifically alternative social media, and then we use AI to identify violent threats, hate speech, so anti-Semitism, racism, misogyny, anti-queer content, negative content, and offensive language. And in doing that, we can also track disinformation. This is really important because the social media landscape has dramatically evolved over the past decade. You know, it used to be, for those who can remember, old-fashioned TV, you had about 4 or 5 channels and you got a bit of everything, right? News, entertainment, sports. The big social media channels are kind of like that. Facebook, Instagram, same thing. But since then, over the past decade, there's been an explosion, right? Same with streaming television. You can get whatever you want. If you want to watch The Crocodile Hunter all day, every day, you can do that. And it's the same with social media. If you want to join a site where people share your views that are perhaps far-right extremist or anti-queer, there's a site for you. This is some of the landscape, right? Most of you are very familiar with Facebook if you're old. TikTok, Instagram, Snap, you know, you guys all know these. Most of you won't have heard of a lot of these other sites because you're generally good people, right? But what makes these sites in alternative social media is different is 2 things. One, they are unmoderated, which means you can say whatever you want, no matter how nasty or how heinous, and it will stay there. Number 2, there's channels sort of created to fit every type of horrible thing, right? So if you're anti-Semitic, you probably want to go and hang out on Gab because there's a lot of anti-Semites there. If you hate women, you want to go hang out on incels because that's where you're going to find your brethren. So it goes on and gets worse and worse, and this ecosystem keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And here's just a few statistics. Telegram, which most of you would have heard of, has over 1 billion subscribers. But there are others here that are growing very, very fast. You know, Threads, increasingly popular, MeWe, Mastodon, and these ones are more of the sane, normal sites, but, you know, they're growing very fast. Now, some of my statistics are American. We're an American company, so I apologise. But a couple of years ago, Pew Research did some wonderful deep diving into this alt social ecosystem, and they found out that 6% of Americans only get their news from these sites. So you can imagine what that's like if you're on an anti-Semitic site, what type of news you're going to be reading on a regular basis. For almost half of Americans understand or believe that they read disinformation on social media every single day. More than half of those people think that tech companies should not touch it and it should stay there, because they believe their right to freedom of speech is more important than removing lies from social media. Now look, I agree. It can be very, very difficult on the spectrum of a pure truth and outright lie to work out where that line is. Because, you know, we all embellish a story every now and again to get a bit of a laugh, perhaps. That's not really a lie, but it's not always the truth. But where's that line in terms of where a social media company should pull it down or not? So look, it's difficult, but I don't know about you, I would prefer to have some of this stuff taken down. So all of these things come together to create an exceptionally toxic environment for all of these sites, right? And I'm not going to go through all of these examples. That black box up there should say Kiwi Farms. But here's a couple. So Discord, very, very popular gaming site. This year has been embroiled in child sexual exploitation. So their platform has been used for this. They were also involved in the leaking of classified US government documents, which was a huge, huge problem. Telegram, the most popular site, is just the worst, right? And there's so many case studies here of awful things that have happened. But the most recent one, actually in California a couple of weeks ago, 2 people were indicted for running a channel called Terragram. And on this site, they openly recruited people with neo-Nazi views and then helped them plot attacks. And people carried out attacks in Slovakia, in Turkey, and thankfully the FBI actually foiled one that was going to take place in the US, where they would be attacking US electricity grids. Gab, known anti-Semitic site, was where the Pittsburgh synagogue shooter was radicalized, posted his manifesto before he went on to shoot a huge amount of people who were at synagogue. There's so many more, but we won't go through them all because everyone will start to get very depressed. I can feel it already. Right, so on top of all of that, this ecosystem, alternative social media, is a breeding ground for disinformation. It's where a lot of it is seeded. And my personal belief is that the reason this is so popular is because most of the people on these sites already hold certain views, right? They have hate towards certain groups of individuals. So it makes them more susceptible to believing lies that they read about these groups. And what we find is there are certain narratives that are pervasive. They're always there. And they can be shaped and twisted to certain events that are happening or certain people's motivations. You know, for example, a pervasive narrative is immigrants are criminals. That's pervasive. Another one is that there is a Jewish cabal running the world and controlling everything. Yeah, laughing because it's hilarious, it's absurd, but people believe this, right? Another one, which is even nastier, is that trans people are pedophiles. Right? These are narratives that people believe to be true. And they go on to influence and to feed into actual events that are happening in the real world, and they can have very damaging repercussions. So, 2 specifics. There was a study done in 2020, which was before COVID, that said disinformation costs the global economy around $78 billion a year. Now, that was before COVID. It's gotten much worse since then, so this number must be through the roof by now. When you post disinformation or a lie online on social media, it will be shared 70% more than a truth. A lie will also reach the first 1,500 social media users 6 times faster than a truth. This is pretty scary. And the worst part about this is actually your brain, because we are programmed to remember lies more easily and faster than we are to remember truth. And here's a couple of crazy examples, and you guys can use this in your everyday life and think about whether or not it's true. A pervasive narrative, urban legend, if you will, for Pepsi is that they use aborted baby fetuses to flavour their soda. It's crazy. McDonald's. All the missing children in the world are due to McDonald's. McDonald's takes them, grinds them up and puts them into your burgers. Right? Both of these things are completely untrue, right? They're insane. I see your shock. You're like, what the hell? Who believes that? But I challenge you all to not remember these things, right? Next time you're thinking Coke or Pepsi, or you're telling a hilarious story. You're telling this story to your friends at a party about McDonald's, but it stays in your brain. So if you think about the crazy stuff, but then think about the not so crazy stuff that is still disinformation, think about how toxic that is in terms of the way we process information and the way we remember things and the way it slants our views. So I'm trying to keep my eye on the clock here. Some other specific case studies, Wayfair, Bud Light, and even the Ukraine-Russia war. These ones are a lot more serious and a lot more damaging. So soon after Russia invaded the Ukraine, there was talk by Putin and Biden about the justification for Russia's invasion. It was because the US had been sponsoring bioweapons labs in the Ukraine. That was complete fabrication. It started in alternative social media. It started to gain momentum, it was refined, it moved to mainstream social media, it moved to actual media, and then before you knew it, you had global politicians talking about this. And today, that is still used as justification by Putin and his advisors for why they'd invaded. Not true. Bud Light. Last year in the US, to mark Gay Pride Month, Bud Light released some promotional cans with the face of a very well-known trans woman called Dylan Mulvaney. Bud Light, very well-meaning in this campaign, I thought it was a great idea, but they obviously underestimated how many of their consumers held very conservative views. Before they knew it, this went completely out of control. Everyone was up in arms because they thought Dylan's face was on every single can. It wasn't. You had celebrities and politicians calling for boycotts, and Bud Light suffered significant revenue losses because people were boycotting their brand. Right? Their sales dropped 20% in 1 month, and their revenue has still not recovered because people refuse to drink Bud Light. In addition to that, executives, staff, even infrastructure were threatened with physical violence. There were bomb threats called in to some of the brewing labs there, which was pretty crazy. And even Dylan Mulvaney suffered some pretty horrific threats of violence. Wayfair, similar type of thing. These guys were probably one of the first big corporations to really be the victim of malicious disinformation campaigns, started by a QAnon member, we believe, said that when you're purchasing furniture from Wayfair, you weren't actually purchasing furniture, you were actually purchasing a child. So they were saying that Wayfair was involved in an illicit global sex trafficking ring involving children. And this went so viral, the FBI had to shut down their hotline because so many people were calling in genuinely believing that they had found these missing children. Kids who were sitting at home in their bed just sort of having fun at home were embroiled in this. People had said that they had been stolen. News to them when the police turned up at their home to question people that had no idea what was going on. Right? This happened years ago, and still today, when people say, oh, that person shops at Wayfair, they're actually suggesting that that person is a pedophile. Wayfair cannot shake the reputation to its brand that this disinformation campaign has caused. A very recent one. Here's some shots from our platform. Right? Crazy. These are some shots from our platform. We use, as I said, AI to track all this sort of stuff, so you can see how this particular claim, disinformation, that immigrants are eating people's pets in Springfield, Ohio, went viral. So again, this taps into that pervasive narrative that immigrants are criminals. It was played on, it was ramped up, and it started to go viral, and before you knew it, Donald Trump stated it as a fact in the debate with Kamala Harris a couple of weeks ago. Why did Donald Trump do this? Because he knows that the notion that immigrants are criminals plays very well to his base. He knows it's not true. He didn't care. But the real world effects beyond that were very serious. You had Haitian migrants in Springfield who were actually being physically assaulted on the street, right? It was very, very scary. You had the public officials in Springfield, Ohio, coming out and emphatically saying, this is not true. No one has reported this to us. It is a lie. And it really did spiral out of control, and it was very, very concerning. And these things have huge implications in people's physical safety and on even the validity of our democratic institutions. Looking to the future, and it's not all bleak, guys. I know I've painted a very bleak picture, and I'm sorry about that. But, things are moving very, very fast. AI plays a very important role in how fast things are moving, both good and bad, right? Bad actors are using AI on these sites to push further disinformation, right? You can make a deep fake, you can make a cheap fake for a couple of bucks. It's very, very easy. That causes a lot of problems. Malicious disinformation campaigns are being planted and manipulated to serve purposes, whether it's of a foreign government, whether it's of an individual, whether it's of a corporation. This stuff is very dangerous. And then we have sophisticated fraud and theft campaigns, which I know a couple of my speakers can dive into further. Big tech absolutely needs to be held more accountable, right? They moved fast and they broke things, and a lot of things are very broken, right? So they certainly need to start reeling some things in, and I think organisations like Facebook have a lot to answer for, and they're not doing enough yet. But they can't fix the problems themselves. Governments need to be a lot more reactive here. They need to be punishing individuals who are inciting violence. They also need to be holding businesses a lot more accountable and hitting them where it hurts, which is, the back pocket. And they also need to move much faster when it comes to the development of legislation and policy around the ethical development of technology and AI. Because not all companies are like mine. Not all companies think carefully about this and take responsibility for how they're developing AI and how it's being used. And beyond that, a lot of the problems that exist that we're seeing pop up on these alternative social media sites are linked to bigger issues that we're seeing across society. Right, so we have people who have more than they've ever had before, but they're also increasingly unhappy. They're unhappy with their job and their income. They're unhappy with their healthcare. They're unhappy with the education for their kids. They're looking for people to blame. We can see these shifts that are happening in politics all around the world. So we as a society need to really try and work to understand where some of these issues are stemming from and how we can better address them. So AI is a wonderful tool, but as has been said already today, it is not the solution for everything. We need to think carefully about how we develop it, and we also need to address a lot of other issues that are popping up at the same time. Thank you.